Hi, I'm Beth Rebay, the director of the Civics Project, or the host of the Civics Project, and the director of Repair, a health and disability justice organization that sponsors the Civics Project. Before we begin today's episode on the Food and Drug Administration, I'd like to share a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Los Angeles Basin and South Channel Islands, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Turahatom, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Hihiram, the elders, and Eohinkam, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. So, thank you for joining us for episode 29 of the Civics Project, focused on the Food and Drug Administration. And I want to start by just taking us back into a little bit of the history of the FDA, or rather the history that led to the existence of the FDA. So before we had a Food and Drug Administration back in the 19th century, there were some precedents. The first were for sort of deliberate regulation of food or drugs, and that was through the U.S. Department of Agricultural's division of the Patent Office, the Agricultural Division of the U.S. Patent Office in 1848 started to do some very initial regulation. But for the most part, almost all food and most drugs were unregulated. Some even say that the history of the FDA goes back longer, all the way to 1820, when a group of physicians first founded an organization named United States Pharmacopoeia, a nonprofit that I believe still exists and that focused on promoting legislation to hold drug manufacturers accountable for their products. So they started to build momentum about that, but weren't actually succeeding yet in getting many or most products regulated. Beginning in the 1870s, there were expanded early efforts through proposed legislation getting into Congress, and I believe some of the state level as well, to regulate food and drugs, but with limited impact. There still wasn't any sort of widespread body of law, or at least legislation, that was regulating what could be done with food or drugs. So for the most part, the market for food and drugs in the United States operated with the presumption, let the buyer beware, and that continued through the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. What became the FDA was basically created in 1906 via the Food and Drug Act of 1906, which was signed into law by Theodore Roosevelt. However, 5 years later, in 1911, the Supreme Court decided to significantly limit the interpretation of the Food and Drug Act of 1906, saying that the US government did not have the authority to regulate, quote, false claims over efficacy. So in other words, the Supreme Court was saying the FDA had no authority to determine whether companies could make false claims about drugs they were selling, claiming, for instance, that it would do something positive that it doesn't actually do. In 1927, the USDA Division of Chemistry, which is basically where the Food and Drug Act of 1906 was being regulated, became the new Food, Drug, and Insecticide Bureau, and then just 3 years later was renamed the Food and Drug Administration. So we have a 19th century history, we have the 1906 Act, and then we finally see the emergence of an entity renamed the Food and Drug Administration in 1930. But its ability to regulate drugs in particular has kind of already been hamstrung by the Supreme Court in 1911. So we get up to 1937, and a pharmaceutical company known as the S.E. Massengill Company, which later became GlaxoSmithKline, which is still around today. So they manufactured and they distribute an antibiotic using an untested solvent known as diethylene glycol. This is a substance that's generally otherwise used in brake fluid, antifreeze, and automobile lubricants. So GlaxoSmithKline, or rather its predecessor, SC Massengill, releases this antibiotic containing diethylene glycol. The FDA doesn't have any authority to regulate that really or prevent them from doing it. And as a result, 100 people die after taking the drug. And this starts to really generate some public outcry. So this creates a push at the federal level to really strengthen the powers of the FDA. And in 1938, just a year later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs into law the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetic Act, which brings a much wider range of products under the authority of the FDA and basically expands its reach. Before we sort of move up in the history or talk about what's true today, I just want to say a little bit of the context of the early, or acknowledge a little bit of the context of the early 20th century. And in particular, I'm thinking about the Industrial Revolution and the growth of technologies like chemistry and biochemistry and pharmacology in ways that weren't ever thoroughly precedented in prior centuries. So federal law and policy was having to develop to cope with the fact that, you know, drugs might be mass marketed, but on a much smaller scale. Before the 20th century, as we start to see railroads and other forms of transportation becoming more accessible, it's possible for companies to send one product all over the country and even export it. And manufacturing and mass production means that a pharmaceutical company can basically make enough of the medication, or is starting to be at the point where they can make enough medication to reach the whole nation. So the scope and impact of problems with drugs was expanding to a degree that the federal government couldn't ignore. And again, the S.A. Massengill antibiotic scandal, which killed 100 people, was occurring in this era. There was really so little regulation of what chemicals were put into food or drugs that were going to be consumed by humans. And at the same time, the technology, the chemistry was evolving. So there was sort of an increasing emergent danger that really came to a head, particularly in the 1930s and 40s. So now we finally got an FDA that's named as such and is backed up by public opinion and by law, and has some real authority to exert control both in agriculture, although some of that authority still rested with the US Department of Agriculture, and in drug manufacturing and distribution. So one of the emergent concepts that became important in this period in the 1940s, so now we've got this FDA, which really has a lot more power, and they posited the concept and then began to regulate what they termed prescription-only drugs. So we're used to the idea of over-the-counter or OTC medications and medications you get with a prescription. But of course, if you had been around in the 19th century or early 20th century, these wouldn't have been meaningful distinctions. Anything that was available to buy was potentially available for anybody to buy, with some localized exceptions. So one of the things the FDA started to regulate was things which you did need a doctor's supervision in order to take. And these sort of initial concepts were finally written into law, statutory law passed by Congress in the 1950s. And in the same period, 1940s, early 1950s, the courts were also closing some of the prior legal loopholes that had previously prevented the FDA from regulating what they now termed in the 1940s and 50s, quote, false therapeutic claims. So the FDA was developing the power to tell the public when a company was lying about what its product might supposedly do. So let's jump up a bit. It's not that there's no important history to talk about in the late 20th century, but we have limited time. So I want to take us to today and say a little bit more about the ways in which the FDA is structured. So first, the FDA today has over 9,000 employees and its budget is in the billions. And its impact on our lives can't really be underestimated because about 20 to 25% of everything that makes up the US economy involves products that are FDA regulated. So what the FDA does can have enormous economic as well as health effects and environmental effects. So again, 20 to 25% of our economy has some sort of FDA regulatory process, meaning something Food and Drug Administration is involved in before that product gets to market and after it does in some instances. The head of the FDA today is a person called the Commissioner of Food and Drugs. And it's an important enough post that that person has to be appointed by the president, and something like a lot of our cabinet posts and Supreme Court appointments, they're not as publicized. That commissioner has to be approved by the Senate. So presidential appointment and Senate confirmation puts a person at any given time in the position of Commissioner of Food and Drugs. And once that commissioner is in place, they then report back to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who reports directly to the president. So one of the things that makes the Food and Drug Administration very political is that because it affects so much of the US economy, it tends to be under tremendous political pressure from economic interests. So when I say economic interests, I mean like a big agriculture, big, sort of factory farms and major, conglomerates in the farming industry. Pharmaceutical companies, right, have a major stake, obviously, in what the FDA does. Medical equipment and device manufacturers, and also cosmetic manufacturers, which have fallen under the influence of the FDA. So we see that lobbyists work very, very hard to influence policy at the FDA and do so both directly and through lobbying of Congress members who then, can influence things about the FDA's budget or the statutory, meaning legislative rules that the FDA operates under. And, I won't try today to even start to unpack, nor am I the person who has the most expertise about this. There's some really brilliant researchers who know substantially more than I do as a sort of broad civics educator and policy analyst. But one of the things that we know is that the FDA processes then are substantially affected by these economic forces, and that can often work against the public interest. So to break that down a little, I want to start by talking about what does the drug approval process involve. So generally, to get a drug approved by the FDA could be as short, it's usually not this short, but it could be as short as 1 week if a number of things have already been done, or this is sort of a modified version of a drug that's been well tested before. The general median range could go up as high as 8 months. And with the average usually being a little bit less than 6 months. That doesn't mean, however, that every drug is approved that quickly. Sometimes drug approvals can take years if more information or data is needed, or if the safety risks associated with the drugs are high. So the process of drug approval involves clinical trials, and most of our listeners know, but if anyone doesn't, right, a clinical trial is basically a kind of medical test or medical study in which people have consented to participate on an experimental basis in being the human subjects who test out a drug. Clinical trials can be done for other things like other kinds of procedures or treatments, but are most commonly done with drugs. And a clinical trial can happen when a drug has not been approved for mass use, or a device or procedure that involves a particular device has not been approved for the general public, but there's limited research approval to work with a number of people who consent to test out the particular drug. So clinical trials usually have fairly strict scientific rules they're supposed to be following. And the FDA process involves 3 phases of clinical trials, so multiple segments. And the first is going to be relatively small. It's going to have less than 100 people typically. And so testing with a small group just to see what comes up. Is there any horrible unintended consequence? Are there some indications of benefit? Then a second phase with more people, might be around 300. And then a third phase in which the two initial test groups did okay enough with the drug in question or the device in question that it can go to a third phase where it might have something around 3,000 test subjects. So these 3 phases have to be completed for FDA approval. And since you're talking about 3 different studies, which might be completely from scratch, and the work might have already been done, from when the application is, process is first initiated to when it's approved, those clinical trials could easily take 8 months or more. In addition to the drug approval process, the FDA also inspects the label. So it is checking to see, are the claims on this drug label accurate? Are the risks disclosed if they need to be? And it's directly inspecting at least some manufacturing sites. So the FDA will come and see, is the environment in which drugs are being made safe and clean and following all sorts of health regulations? And does the process make sense given what is being produced? So the FDA initially can approve or not approve drugs, also checks the labels, and then further goes on to inspect production. So somewhat rigorous. What does it mean if something is FDA approved? The fact that it went through these 3 phases of clinical trials, does that mean it's safe? No, not necessarily. Unsafe medications are passed all the time or approved all the time. The basic idea is that you can get FDA approval when you have enough data through these 3 phases, these 3 clinical trials, to show that the benefits of the drugs outweigh the risks. That's the standard, right? Doesn't mean there's no risk, doesn't mean there's not significant risks, doesn't mean the drug is actually safe to take. It just means that given what the drug is being used for, the benefit of the taking it in the estimation of the FDA and supported by data from clinical trials says the benefits outweigh the risks. And obviously there's some subjective interpretation that can go into what does the FDA define as a benefit and a risk, right? How significant, how are those things measured? That there are standardized and statistical ways in which those risk versus reward proportions are ultimately calculated. Hope that made sense to folks. Basically, they've got some numbers they're using to try to measure benefits versus risks, but there's still human determinations of what each benefit and each risk is worth, essentially. So the FDA basically is assessing against the severity of the condition being treated and the benefits that can be derived by treating it versus the risks or harms. Does the benefit outweigh the harm? Now, there's often a misconception, not just in terms of how patients feel, but how doctors seem to think about it, that if a drug is FDA approved and is being mass disseminated, it's safe enough unless there's an explicit warning saying, don't give to this type of patient or to people with this condition. And again, one of the ways that this can be, or rather one of the ways that this can be dangerous is that means, if you and your doctor are both thinking of the drug as relatively safe, nobody may pay any attention, nor will all patients even know how to research such a thing, to thinking about, is there some reason, given the studies that were done and what we know of this patient, why we might want to be more cautious with this medication? So it's often true that the kind of halo of FDA approval can overcome patient reservations, as well as, in some instances, doctor and pharmacist recommendations. People assume that the FDA is keeping things safe enough. And that may mean that we don't always contemplate where could there be higher risks for some patients in taking certain kinds of drugs or using certain devices. I wish I could take the time to unpack that more, but there's a few other areas I want to talk about. Food regulations. So far I've just been talking about drug approval, but the FDA regulates a lot of food. There's some exceptions. So some meat, some poultry, and some egg products are regulated by the US Department of Agriculture, whereas others do come under the auspices of the FDA, but pretty much all the food that we eat otherwise is subject to some kind of FDA regulation. The Food and Drug Administration publishes something called the Food Code, which is basically a set of guidelines which are meant to help local agencies like your city, your county, regulate food, not just in retail settings, but in restaurant settings. So the FDA recommendations are guidelines essentially that local municipalities use. So in part, the FDA is just responsible for guiding local governments and state governments around the nation about food safety, but it's also regulating food directly, including, looking at, does the product actually match the claims of the manufacturer in terms of what the ingredients are and the proportions they're supposed to be of those ingredients. The FDA is trying to make sure that the label is reasonably accurate. Does not mean it's perfect, but reasonably accurate. And it's trying to guide local municipalities, and it's got various kinds of regulations in place that manufacturers are expected to comply with and subject to some inspection for. There are also some kinds of optional regulations. So companies that may be motivated to go through voluntary FDA inspections so that they can label their product in a certain way that it was FDA certified or FDA regulator inspected. And this, often describes, for instance, some aspects of supplement manufacturing. So for instance, herbs and some vitamin and mineral supplements, may have partial FDA regulation and may opt for more. The FDA also does regulate food and drugs for animals, but not vaccines for animals, interestingly. Those are regulated by the US Department of Agriculture. And then there's some, what I would think of as gray area products, things which involve chemicals and are coming in contact with bodies, but are not FDA regulated and not regulated by any federal government agency. So an example of this would be cat litter. If you have pets, right, the food and drugs that they take are subject to FDA regulation, but the litter that a cat uses is not. And this has mattered because sometimes cat litter companies use chemicals in cat litter that are meant to, let's say, control odors, that wind up making pets or even humans whose skin comes in contact with the litter sick. So again, these are sort of gray area examples. Nobody's directly consuming it, right? Cats are thankfully not eating cat litter. And so it's not being regulated as a food or a drug, but so chemicals can slip in other ways. And again, some products are just not regulated by any government agency, while others that may enter our body, let's say, residue from cleaning products, are not regulated by the FDA, but are covered by the Environmental Protection Agency. So a great deal of what your skin and your body and your digestive system are coming into contact is going to be regulated either by the FDA, the USDA, meaning the US Department of Agriculture, or the Environmental Protection Agency, but there are products that slip through all those cracks. When a product is unregulated in that way, unless there's some other particular law that would affect the product, like something about a particular chemical, your only recourse if you were harmed by the product would be a lawsuit, right, to pursue a product liability claim. But this, of course, requires that individual people be ready to sue and go to court. There are a number of things I'd like to also touch base about today, and one is just giving us a sense of the scope. How many drugs have been approved and are still approved today by the FDA? And the number is a bit over 19,000, or approximately 19,000 approved drugs right now. And there are recalls of about 4,500 devices and drugs, but mostly drugs, per year. The Food and Drug Administration has the power to mandate device recall, but this is one of the interesting gaps in existing policy. Drug recall has to be at the initiation of the manufacturer. So the FDA can issue a recommendation to a drug company and say, and say, we've determined that the risks associated with your product no longer outweigh the benefits. We recommend a recall, but the manufacturer does not have to comply. It's up to them whether to get the product immediately off the market. Now, the FDA can revoke its approval, so there's some things the FDA can do to prevent more of the product than has already been manufactured from entering the market. But often there will be, months to even years supplies of a particular drug that have already been disseminated in various ways. And the FDA does not have the power to force a drug company to recall the literal bottles or tubes or containers that are already out there with the drug. So this is a major area of controversy in current drug approvals. Once it's approved, the FDA can revoke its approval, which would affect new manufacturing, but the FDA can't recall. It can only recommend a recall. However, while this is true for drugs, the Food and Drug Administration is allowed to mandate recalls of devices. So let's say, for instance, there's an implant for a joint replacement surgery or for a heart procedure. The FDA does have the authority to say these devices are not safe, recall all the ones that are already out there. The most expensive recall in history was in 1982 by Johnson & Johnson. Some of the older folks listening in may recall this scandal. There were 31 million bottles of Tylenol, which were implicated in contamination with cyanide. So Tylenol tainted with cyanide, which can be quite deadly. And they had to recall those 31 million bottles, and it cost them about $100 million to do it. And this was in 1982. In today's dollars, it would be significantly more. In getting a sense of sort of how frequently there needs to be a recall or a revocation, or at least major new safety warnings, Dr. Joseph Ross with the Yale School of Medicine did a study from 2001 to 2010, so that 10-year period, and found that just under 1/3 of all medications approved by the FDA initially had major safety issues years later. So in other words, the FDA is getting drugs to market and then major safety issues, some of which are enough to prompt a recall, some of which don't, but require lots of new warnings that the public wasn't getting initially, and some that result in basically modification of the drug will emerge years after initial approval. So that's should be something that worries us, thinking about the fact that maybe somewhere around 30 to 33% of the drugs that we might encounter, especially newer ones, may have major safety risks that our doctors don't know, our pharmacists don't know, and that we don't know is certainly alarming. And in addition, and we always have to keep in mind that even when the sort of bulk of safety issues come to light, the FDA approval has no authority to initiate a recall. And so if a drug company is unethical enough to decide that the cost of product liability lawsuits, if it continues to sell the drug that should have been recalled, if the cost of litigation is less than the cost of continuing to sell the drug that's already out there, we have a number of examples of companies choosing to do that, even though the FDA has said, hey, the risks do not balance out with the benefits. This drug is not safe enough to be on the market. We have a bunch of examples where drug companies decided we're not going to voluntarily initiate recall because we can make more money than we will lose in lawsuits. So we can understand a little bit about, the implications of the safety statistics, keeping in mind that side effects or harms may emerge years later. And even when they do, that doesn't necessarily mean there'll be an immediate recall. We can also just identify what are some of the areas that tend to be understudied in the FDA approval process. So one, as noted in this immediately prior discussion, is just the effects over time. When you're doing your clinical trials in the space sometimes of a year or less, there may be a bunch of different things that you wouldn't capture in those initial trials, which are going to show up later. There's also often under attention to population-specific risk. So people with certain kinds of medical conditions may not be adequately represented in the sample of people who the drug is being tested on, and therefore they may not realize, hey, this particular medication is dangerous for diabetics or for people with asthma until it's already been exposed and used by a larger population that wasn't warned of the risks. So these kinds of, understanding what happens over time, what happens to people with specific conditions, are there differences between age groups? The FDA will certainly impose different standards for testing a drug on children in some instances, but there's not always enough attention to how does this drug affect elders, as opposed to what is its track record across age groups. So notwithstanding this reality that we've got somewhere over 30% of the medications that go to market then turn out to have major safety issues identified later, the Trump administration pushed very hard for faster drug approval. They really wanted to shrink that waiting period from application to approval as much as possible. And the FDA certainly, I would say, experienced some of those effects. That doesn't mean there were radical changes, but we couldn't have expected them to really completely withstand that pressure. And it's not clear yet what's going to happen at least not clear to me, what's going to happen under the Biden administration in terms of their relationship to drug approval processes. So one of the things we have to think about is, how does this affect our own relationship to taking medications? And when patients or the families or loved ones are trying to do our own cost benefits analysis, one of the things we can factor in is how new is this medication? Because the chances that it has undisclosed or unidentified risks, or of course higher with newer medication. On the other hand, though, sometimes the latest medication, the cutting edge medication, is exactly what you want. It may resolve risks that were present in older ones. So this is something that, patients and their doctors ideally would be able to weigh carefully, although it's hard, obviously, to make those assessments when most of us just don't have a lot of information. We can also remember that the FDA approval process shouldn't be considered a guarantee of safety ever for any drug. The only thing FDA approval means is the benefits in their estimation outweigh the risks, and that assessment is supported by some science. We know that sometimes the science that backs up FDA approval is unreliable for a few reasons. A common one is that the funding available to run clinical trials is usually coming from companies that are trying to get drugs approved. And so in some instances, all of the evidence that's given to the FDA may have been influenced by bias because the researchers are getting paid by the people who want the drug to be declared safe. So lack of thoroughly independent study and conflicts of interest continue to be at issue, particularly when we have this really wealthy pharmaceutical industry, or set of industries rather. We also see that there's not enough attention in the approval process to interactions between drugs in some cases, very little assessment of whether drugs and herbs may have harmful interactions, or drugs and other kinds of vitamin supplements. So often that information will emerge over time, but usually because people are having drug interactions or drug-herb interactions or drug supplement interactions and reporting them to the FDA. And when there's enough of them, then it starts to get attention. So we should understand that, particularly with newer medications and substances, often we are the fourth phase, the fourth population on which this drug or substance or device is being tested, particularly if it's a newer substance or medication. So I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, what about the COVID-19 vaccine, right? All of this certainly doesn't make us feel great about the current state of the Food and Drug Administration, though I would say that we should feel a lot better about its existence than the straits we might have been in if we were still in the 19th century. Oh, and one of our Zoom attendees is reminding us of another helpful thing, that we understudied the interactions between drugs and chemical ingredients in food. And that's an important acknowledgement too. Thank you for that. So returning to the question of the COVID-19 vaccine, I first want to preface this by saying that I got the vaccine as quickly as I was able to get an appointment, and I'm really glad that I did. And I certainly promote vaccination to anyone who's open to it. I want to acknowledge the fears of folks who are saying that we don't know if this vaccine is safe. And when I step back and think about the sort of breadth of things we know about the FDA approval process, I would say that that is true, right? I've spent a good half hour now saying to everybody that just because a drug is FDA approved doesn't mean it's safe. And most of us took the vaccine when it wasn't FDA approved, when it had just gotten this emergency authorization, which is, granted for very extraordinary circumstances like a global pandemic. So the vaccines for COVID, Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, didn't have the time to go through all the phases of clinical approval before required for FDA approval, and they were allowed to go to market really quickly. So I want to say that I completely respect and share at least some of the fear that folks have about, like, this is brand new. There hasn't been time to see what it'll do to people over time or to detect all the risks that there might be. So how do we know if it's safe to take? And while I've heard public officials say the word safe a lot, what we can say is what the FDA is telling us is that the benefits outweigh the risks. What I will say is that I feel a lot safer relatively about taking the COVID-19 vaccine than I do that a lot of the other substances that are new on the market for other sorts of conditions, drugs, devices, and so forth. Because of the national and global urgency of the COVID-19 pandemic, the vaccine testing and approval processes has had high priority and unusually rigorous attention. So there's been an enormous stake in making sure that the vaccine doesn't have major side effects, particularly because it's controversial right now, and that the testing process is, beyond reproach. And I think that's been true since the, essentially search for a viable vaccine started. This has had basically a very wide range of expertise and stakeholders around the world, not just in the US or US companies, invested in it. So I actually feel like when we think about the COVID-19 vaccine, this isn't one of the indications where we have to say, there was just some quick and dirty research that was funded by the manufacturer, and, this was just sort of rushed to market without being looked at. The vaccine was rushed to market given the severity of the need, but the processes behind it were comparatively rigorous. So with that said, the questions that we can ask ourselves as we think about vaccination in this context is, do we think the benefits of being vaccinated outweigh the risks? There is a real risk with any vaccine that there'll be some unintended or unanticipated consequence, or anticipated consequence, which the public health authorities and manufacturers felt was worth the risk, that will surface later and could do harm. That's always possible. We can never rule that out completely. But the other thing that also weighs in the direction of vaccine safety in this instance is simply its mass administration. The three variants, meaning Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson around the world, and the fairly consistent reports of virtually no very serious side effects. So people are not dying from taking this vaccine, which is already really good. So my personal calculus is to say, given the certain risks we know are associated with not being vaccinated, which is the increased chance that if you're exposed to COVID, you would need emergency care or might die or might suffer long-term consequences. Weighing that against this sort of unknown of the vaccine itself, for me, it's not hard to say, yeah, I wanted to get vaccinated and I'll take any boosters I need to take. But I think that it's important for all of us collectively to have some foundation to really think about, where does our distrust of government regulation come from? Is it grounded? And knowing more of the basics of what is the FDA, what's been its history in politics, I think is an important step in being able to actually make choices for yourself or have meaningful conversations with others who want your guidance. With that said, this has been just a very preliminary and quick introduction of the Food and Drug Administration. So for those who would like to learn more, I want to recommend Fran Hawthorne's book, Inside the FDA, The Business and Politics Behind the Drugs We Take and the Food We Eat. So Fran Hawthorne, Inside the FDA, is my suggestion of the week for those who would like more learning. I want to invite everybody back next week to join us for our 30th episode on due process, which I think is extremely important on a lot of fronts, so due process of law. So we'll be coming back together. Some folks have been asking me, is the Civics Project going to be talking about the Texas abortion decision or Roe versus Wade soon? We're working on it for this fall. Just want to make sure we find just the right guests to come and talk about it with us. So stay tuned for that. And again, please join us next Sunday for our episode on due process. For those joining us today, in Zoom, you'll get a message afterwards with the link to our events registration page. You probably already have it. And for those listening to the podcast episode, you can find links for our events registration in the podcast description. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in today.